Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I am your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I am going to be talking today about a new book that is making lots of noise about therapy and how bad therapy is. It's called Bad Therapy, and this book is going around now. People are talking about it. The author, Abigail Shrier, was on Jordan Peterson and making the rounds on different podcasts, and a lot of people are talking about this because she's kind of blowing the whistle on a lot of the practices that I think you'll agree are tremendously, dangerously bad. And this is coming from a very secular position, so that's what's really interesting about this. It's not the same old narrative about, secular therapy being not religious or not spiritual or not centered on God. It's actually much more basic than that. And it's actually looking at mental health as a field in whole, as a terribly bad operation. And the points that she makes are really interesting, and I think we really need to take them seriously. And also, through our Catholic lens, I think we will see that she is not saying anything new. And actually, one of our great Catholic trailblazers has already said everything she's saying. So I'm going to open that up and talk about that here as well. In fact, that particular trailblazer is going to be speaking at our first ever live summit. So I'm going to be talking about his work, his book, and how really this is nothing new right after this.
I spent the last 10 years learning how to help people using the best techniques available in psychology integrated with the Catholic faith. Now we've figured out that there's a better way to help people than just slapping a Catholic label on the same secular model of therapy you find anywhere else. The real question is, how will we make this shift to a new model of truly Catholic accompaniment, keeping the psychological sciences in mind while opening up to a more human and more effective approach? This podcast is here to give you the answer. Join me and follow along as I take you behind the scenes of what this new model looks like, using recorded audio from sessions working with my team, with colleagues, and even directly with clients. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast.
All right, so we have Abigail Shrier. She wrote this book, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. And she is looking at the basic pattern of what is trending in regular psychotherapeutic mentality right now. What is the current zeitgeist, the current sort of environment of mental health and psychology? And these are trending pop psych, fashionable things that you've heard of before, and a lot of it is what post-COVID, and even really before COVID, a lot of these things were starting to develop. And she's really blowing the lid off of this to show not only how unhelpful they are, but also how dangerous they are. So a little bit of history here. If we back up, we've talked a lot about the trends in the last 100 years and postmodernism and relativism, and even talking about Cartesian dualism and the separation of body and spirit. What does it mean when our understanding of humanity is divorced from this reality of having a spiritual dimension and this psychological, biological dimension of who we are? It's a lot of jargon. What are we essentially saying here? We don't know who we are. If we don't know who we are, we don't know why we break. And if you don't know why you're even breaking, then you don't know how to fix what's broken. Our basic model, our basic sort of example is, if your car breaks down, you take it to a mechanic who knows how a car is made in the first place, and that person can then help put the car back together, fix what's broken, order new parts. They are the expert in the thing that you are getting fixed. We have no experts in the thing getting fixed in the field of psychology. And this is why the CatholicPsych Institute has the mission of creating a standard for mental health from a Catholic perspective, because we have the whole vision. We know the spirit. We know the integration with the body. We know that we have this unity between the two, and we know what the effects of having a spiritual life and a spiritual destiny have on our bodies and our psychology. We cannot divorce these two things. If you're made for heaven, that's like what you're ordered for. It's the satisfaction of your soul. It's the deepest answer to your heart's deepest longing. And that's actually what's true about who we are. We're built to be satisfied beyond our wildest imagination. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard. So how could we think about happiness, human flourishing, human wellness, human resolution of distress, all the things that psychology talks about? How in the world can psychology pretend to have an answer to healing or resolving distress for the human person if they don't take into account the fact that we're actually built for heaven and that the ultimate end of each person is the infinite satisfaction that is beyond our wildest imagination? So then when we're like a little unmotivated, or we have some boredom, or we have some sadness, or some depression, or we start worrying, and we have anxiety, and we have maybe anxiety becomes extreme, and then now we are, experiencing compulsions, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder. All of these things are related to our human experience and what we're longing for, looking for, hoping for, what we are unresolved by. And so, of course, if part of the answer is that we're made for heaven, then how could we ever in a million years pretend to help people without taking that into consideration? It's like if you take a fish out of water and you have a fish struggling on land, and then you're trying to come up with ways to make the fish on the land feel better without anybody talking about the fact that the fish actually is made for water. That's basically the state of psychology today. That's the state of our world today. We're all fish out of water, and we're all gasping for, oxygen or really water, but we're all gasping for the thing that we're longing for, that we're actually in need of. And, meanwhile, in this space, this state, we are apart from what we're made for. We can't ever think we're going to satisfy our longings in this state now without taking into consideration what we're made for. Knowing that we're going to be in the water again helps then to deal with the separation that we have right now. It's like we can make the best of it then, because we know that whatever we do here to make the best of it is not the final answer, and we shouldn't be looking for it to be the final answer. So I think that this is tremendously important for anything that anyone calling themselves a psychologist or working in this field of psychology should be thinking about. Well, we have the secular field that has gone astray, that has just bought into, or even created in some ways, the postmodern secular relativism hook, line, and sinker, and now they have really led the charge in promoting these values in our world. And so Abigail Shrier here is exposing the problems for what they are, totally from a secular perspective, which I really respect. I think that that's a really great thing, because she's not relying on a religious argument here. She's just pointing out how what the world is doing is failing. So I want to go through this a little bit, because I think this is really important. If you've heard people talking about this book, obviously, I think you should go read it. You should get it on Audible, listen to the audiobook if you want, or the Kindle version, or go pick up the hard paper version of it and actually hold it in your hands. Really understand this, but I want to just go through this really quickly to talk about some of these topics that she's bringing up here, because she's pointing out what disintegration looks like and what is the fruit of disintegration. Essentially, that's what this book could have been called: Bad Therapy, the Fruit of Disintegration. This is why we are doing the Summit of Integration. This is why we are bringing together experts that see the holistic view and understand how to not fall into the traps that she has laid out here in this book. But number one, she gives us this idea of iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis is the concept that doctors who offer healing can actually hurt instead of heal. And this has always been the case. It's part of any medical doctor, any sort of psychological doctor, anybody who's doing work of a healer, they always have to have a disclaimer. I mean, even a car mechanic, might have a disclaimer. We're going to take a look at your car, but we cannot be held responsible for things that might go wrong because of this process of taking the car apart. So a doctor says the same thing. If you go for cancer treatment, if you go for any kind of treatment, you're going to have to sign off on an expectation and an understanding that you are understanding that there could be things that go wrong in the process of trying to make things go right. Now, in psychology, this is a normal part of the informed consent process. So we have legal forms that we give our patients. You have to sign off on this stuff. And there should be a paragraph, at least a paragraph, in any good therapist informed consent that says therapy might make things worse before they get better. Sometimes poking at systems that have been built up over time as defense mechanisms to figure out certain resolutions might actually unravel some of the ways that people have been sort of getting by. We develop calluses, and if we develop the callus and then maybe the callus is a problem, maybe the bone didn't heal correctly, and then what do you have to do? It's like you have to re-break the bone. You might have to scrape away the callus to get to the underlying cause of what's going wrong. Now, that happens all the time. That's only one version of what she's talking about. What she's talking about is actually even worse than that, because you can have appropriate suffering or difficulty that's part of the healing process. Those examples I just gave. If you want to reset a bone, the idea is you're going to get to the end where the bone is actually set correctly, or you fixed the problem that was underneath the callus. Those kinds of things are still leading in the right direction. There's a whole nother world of iatrogenic experience where, because the intervention was incorrect, it causes more harm than good, even ultimately. And so, if a doctor has a, sort of a diagnosis and they're not sure it's exactly the perfect right diagnosis, and they're going to try this treatment on their best educated guess, it might be the wrong diagnosis and therefore the wrong treatment, and that treatment could do more harm than good. And that's part of what we accept with the medical sciences, because scientists are not God. Doctors are not God. We just take that for granted, that we have to expect that there will be people who are harmed instead of helped by treatment interventions. The problem is that in the world of mental health, and this is what she's drawing out here in the book, in this world of mental health, there is very, very, very little acknowledgement and focus put on this reality. And it is the opposite of what is appropriate, commensurate with the reality. In other words, there is less certainty about diagnosis and treatment and interventions with mental health than there is with physical health. So if you go to a physician and they say, most likely this is the flu, I think I could see this. We did, a sample and we got this back from the labs, and, this is actually a bacterial infection. We're going to use antibiotics. That's pretty good dialed in science at that point. And their interventions are, fairly well researched. And still, they're still going to be telling you, but we don't know the full ramifications of these antibiotics. We've been seeing that antibiotics develop resistance over time. And this is the, 6th time we gave you azithromycin in the last 2 years. And maybe this is going to start to be harmful instead of helpful. Like, they still will tell you things that are, even though the science is really good, and this is a fairly high probability that you are treating the right thing with an effective treatment, they're still going to let you know what the risks might be. Compare that to mental health, where you have master's level and doctoral level trained psychologists, people with like 2 years of training, maybe 4 or 5 years of training, who have then started their own practice and operating for the most part in little bubbles. So usually mental health practitioners are not working in a hospital or in a system where they have constant feedback from other members of the treatment team. And there's lots of other places. Like, for the most part, a lot of this mental health world are people sort of isolated in their way of doing things, what they like, their assessment they like, their way of looking at people that they like, their practice of how they do their interventions, and without much feedback, and certainly without any level of certainty, even less than in the physical sciences. They are diagnosing things and proposing interventions, and less frequently than in the physical sciences are they focusing on the dangers, the risks involved with these kinds of treatments, for the most part. And there's a lot of stereotype in this, but this is what I've seen, and this is what I think most people have experienced. So they're not unfair stereotypes. You go to the therapist office, and it's like you've entered into the kingdom of this therapist. It's like the therapist in the school system, the therapist in town, the therapist that's, court mandated. The therapist carries this weight of authority and expertise, and you enter into the domain of the therapist in their kingdom, and what they say is going to be really impactful because they said it. Their judgment, their diagnosis, their assessment, their prognosis, their treatment plan, their recommendations, those things are carrying heavy, heavy weight. It really is not commensurate with reality. Because number one, these diagnoses are changing all the time. Not like physical sciences, where the flu is the flu. A bacterial infection is a bacterial infection. We can look at it in a lab, we see it under a microscope, and we can actually define what this thing is and why it's a disease. In the world of mental health, they don't have that. Why? Not unsurprisingly, this is a sidebar here, because they're not taking the spiritual life of a person into account. So they're looking at immaterial things. A person, what is a person? Can you look at a person under a microscope? No, of course not. It's not science when you can't look at it under a microscope. I mean, there are social sciences, but the variability and the uniqueness of each individual person is such that it cannot be fully understood through scientific process and method. This is the gross contradiction of applying sciences to the understanding of the human person, as if the science can give you the exhaustive definition and understanding of a person. So this is why we don't have diagnoses that are solid and unchangeable, because the person's immaterial and the person actually is totally unique and unrepeatable. And we get that from our Catholic worldview and a holistic, integrated view of the human person. Secular psychology does not have that particular principle in their understanding of a human person. So this is why we have this horribly dangerous and scandalous reality of iatrogenesis happening in the mental health field. And so Abigail is laying this out in the beginning of the book and saying, so this is why she's taking this responsibility really seriously to really flesh out and call out all the ways that the field is doing harm to people who are vulnerable and trusting in the supposed experts who are supposedly professing this expertise as professionals and leading people astray instead. All right, so then she kind of lays this out and she says, if somebody was to get together a council of evil and harm and come up with a plan to lead people astray and hurt people through bad therapy, bad therapeutic interventions, what would that plan look like? And then she lays it out. She gives 10 principles of bad therapy. She said if somebody was trying really hard to hurt people, this is how they could do it, and this is what they would come up with, which is her journalistic way of basically saying, and that's what everybody's doing. Not assuming that anybody's trying to do it, but we ended up here anyway. So I'm going to go through these 10 points of bad therapy that she talks about. Number 1, over-focus on feelings instead of focusing on change. This is a reversal of really good basic cognitive theory that if we focus our minds on growth and change and positive things, the power of positive thinking. It's a very basic and secular principle of pop psychology. If we focus ourselves on positive change, we actually activate parts of our brain and our hormones and our, neurophysiological system that moves us in the direction of growth and change. The opposite of that is don't focus on what's possible for changing. Focus on what's wrong. Focus on how bad it feels. Let's talk about mindfulness all day long. Just know what your feelings are. Are you aware of your sadness? Can you give a color to your sadness? Can you describe your sadness in 47 words? Can you see sadness in other people? It's on and on and on. Let's do a feelings check-in. All right, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, class. We just started the day. How's everybody feeling? Do you have rain clouds? Do you have sunshine? Not because it matters to change one into the other, just to focus on where we are. There's a cognitive bias that we are looking for things that are problems. And the more we focus on it, if everybody opens up, if half the people see sunshine and half the people see clouds, but we all talk about what we see, the people that see sunshine will statistically start to see more clouds, not the other way around, because we have something called a negativity bias in the way that we think. The more we talk about feelings, the more we talk about what we feel and think and see and all these things, and without any direction, we are always going to lean towards the negative. And that's how we end up doing what we're doing now. Okay, number 2, ruminating. So the same principle. It's like get people thinking about their thoughts. Don't get them to go away from their thoughts. Get them to get stuck in their thoughts. Number 3, let's reward suffering. So this is an interesting one. It's like all these people going to get therapy, all these people showing up to the counselor, all these counselors doing interventions in the school system, all these issues that are coming up. It's like a lot of people are lonely right now. And especially after COVID. What are people looking for in therapy? Are they looking for healing or are they looking for connection? And of course, a lot of people are looking for healing, but I think a lot of people are also getting a lot of connection that they might otherwise be missing in their life. So as the world is on a trajectory moving further and further towards isolation, and now we have AI to fill in the gaps and make us feel like we're connected, social media to make us feel like we're connected, but there's not actual social connection. Well, now we need real social connection. Well, your therapist will give you social connection, but why does your therapist exist? Your therapist exists because you have problems. So you're feeding your need for social connection, which is a problem, but the solution is coming from a person who needs to be focusing on other problems. You don't usually go to therapy just for social isolation and as if the therapist is fixing the problem because now you have a relationship that's feeding your need for relationship. The therapist would call that dependency and make you have to go find other relationships. But if you don't have any problems to talk about, this implicit solution to your loneliness problem disappears. You don't get it anymore. If you show up to the therapist's office and say, I don't really have anything to talk about, the therapist is going to say like, well, I guess my work here is done. I guess we're finished here. Have a good life. Well, that can't happen if that person is trying to get their connection need fed. So what happens? Well, I did have a little argument at work. Oh, good. Tell me more. And I'm being dramatic here, but without being hyperbolic, it is actually the case that a therapist is going to tune up their interest in you when you have a problem. So this is a positive reinforcement of having problems. And so we are positively reinforcing a sort of focus on distress and mental health problems. Okay, number 5, over monitor. We need to over monitor our interior state. This goes back to the thinking all day, checking in on your feelings. And this is actually a symptom of people with an anxiety disorder and in people with depression. They're thinking too much. They're checking in too much. I mean, literally OCD, people call it a checking disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder. I have to check to see if I lock the door. I have to check to see if I've washed my hands enough times. Well, we're implementing checking routines into the day. This is going to cause disorder. All right, number 6, we want to overdiagnose people and give people language to have now an identification with their diagnosis. Everybody has a diagnosis. Everybody's seeing a professional. Everybody gets a diagnosis. Everybody now sees themselves and is identifying themselves with their diagnosis. Well, it used to be like I had a bad day. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Maybe, shockingly, I need to go to confession. But now it's, well, I'm a little bipolar. I'm a little histrionic. I'm a little borderline. There I go again with my borderline parts. It's like, well, what happened to just saying, like, that's a sin? I had a bad day, even if we don't want to get moral about it. It's like, I had a bad day. I need to work on this right now. I need to, get myself out of this rut. There's a difference in the language. When you have an identifiable diagnosis that we identify ourselves with, it becomes more of a state. And that's a problem. Number 7, then, we throw drugs at the problem. We get people on all sorts of SSRIs and Prozac or Adderall because everything is ADD now. Or we get people, looking for the cocktail that's the right mix to dial in exactly how they can not have to deal with any of these symptoms. Number 8, then, she says to label everything trauma. This is a real big problem for us now in our world. And she breaks this open really well in this chapter. And I think it's worth looking at. Even if you get the book and you kind of zero in, go to the section on trauma, because it's really interesting. In our field, we do so much work with trauma. We sort of take it for granted that this is a real thing. Now, to be sure, trauma is a real thing. But the way that we reconceptualize literally everything in light of trauma now is a real problem. Because we now have people looking for the traumas that make sense of their present situation. And so somebody might not remember any trauma. Somebody might have had, my childhood was great. I never had any problems. But now I'm having this marital conflict. And I'm having all these problems with our kids. And, it's causing this fight with my spouse. And so then they go to therapy to try to figure this stuff out. It's like, let's unpack this. Let's go back in time. Like, where did you first start feeling so disconnected? And then long story short, next thing you know, it's like, well, my dad didn't show up at my baseball game and my mom didn't do this. And now there's a place for this to be in the therapeutic context. This is a little spoiler alert. At the end here, I'm going to talk about how she throws away the baby with the bathwater in terms of her book. And a Catholic response can actually take care of the problem she's pointing out without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But there is something to be said for the unscientific nature of historical diagnosis. In other words, what she says here is, if we wanted to prove that Dad not showing up at the baseball game causes marital distress later in life, are those two things actually correlated with each other? You can't do that in reverse. You would have to say, okay, and this is just the scientific method, and this is why you can't scientifically say any of these things. But the scientific method would be such that you say, okay, here's the control group, here's the variable, and now we're going to do a long-term study. So we have, the people whose dad did not show up at baseball, the people whose dad did show up at baseball. It's a double-blind study, so none of the researchers know which group is which. And then they're now evaluating the outcomes in marriage for these kids when they grew up and became adults. And then if double-blind study shows that there's a correlation between the kids whose dad did not show up at baseball and marital distress 20 years later, then we can say, there's a connection. So now that 28-year-old comes in for therapy, and then the therapist says, let's look at your childhood. Did your dad not show up for baseball games? And that would be a scientifically valid approach to bringing that up in that conversation. That's not what we have. We have the opposite. We have the postmodern, secular, relativistic faith of pseudoscientists and scientism, which is a false ideology, pretending like these are quote-unquote evidence-based treatment protocols that are then being applied to whatever you can come up with. What made sense from your past to give us some kind of clarity about the present? Can we work with this somehow? And then we're going to spend the next 2 years, processing your anger at your dad for not showing up at the baseball game. This is insanity. If we're going to have faith in anything, how about we have faith in God and the revelation of Christ? Like these secular therapists have as much faith in their process as we should have faith in the revelation of Christ. But let's not pretend like it's actually science. It's far from anything scientific. So then we're repainting everything as trauma. To be sure, trauma exists. There is evidence-based research to show that certain kinds of things, when they happen to people, and then we look at them in the forward motion going into the future, and then do follow-up studies with people later, have particular symptoms and certain things from things that happen. And traumas are very clear. When I was in school, I was already, and this is 20 years ago, already hearing people start talking about trauma, but not a capital T, a lowercase t trauma. Little traumas, little t traumas. And that was the first sort of indication that we are getting a little convoluted. And we're taking something that could be scientific, and we are now starting to, get messy with how we're applying this science. And that's when ideology and philosophy and pseudoscience faith comes into the picture. We should be getting clearer about what is a trauma and what is not a trauma. Is it lowercase t? What does that mean? Is that even an appropriate word? Because there are real traumas. And it doesn't mean that these little lowercase t traumas aren't painful for people. That's a whole nother point here, is like she makes this point in this book later on. We all have pain and suffering. We all have what is now technically called, affectionately called, lowercase t trauma. It doesn't mean that we don't have suffering in our life. It doesn't mean that it hurts if dad doesn't show up at the baseball game. What it means is, should we be conceptualizing it the same way that somebody who goes through a terrorist attack or is abused, and different things like that have occurred, should we be putting the same frame and framework around these events conceptually? Well, you start to look around and you realize, wait a minute, this is why everybody's getting so delicate. If your parent yells at you, then you're now talking about being traumatized. If your university professor teaches something that is contrary to what you feel safe about, now you need a safe space, as if you're being abused. Doesn't it not make sense that our language led to this situation? And this unscientific approach actually created this problem. So this whole snowflake culture thing where now everybody's so delicate and now we can't, it's like we've created the situation where the things that used to be, worthy of a response of suck it up have now gotten to the point of requiring the same intervention as if somebody has been through a terrorist attack. This is a real problem, and it's been brought to you by secular psychology. Thank you, APA, for ushering in the age of delicacy and fragility and a total lack of any kind of real resilience. All right, so then when we do that, then number 9 is that we have to then label everybody toxic. And so we now have this preponderance of toxic relationships, toxic family. You need to separate from all these toxic people. You have to create space, create boundaries. And we take all these like good ideas like boundaries and we overuse them just the way trauma itself is becoming overused. And then last but not least, number 10 is to create a treatment dependency, because now everybody's so fragile. Everybody's always in danger of being abused and harmed that we need our protectors, the therapists and counselors, the doctors who take care of us because we're all so sick. And these are the 10 steps that could intentionally be developed to really hurt all of society. So I think there's a lot there. We could probably do 10 whole episodes on this right now. But the point being that this is real. This is actually what's happening right now. And now it's come into the school system. So she's got a whole different section, a few chapters on SEL in schools, social emotional learning programs. Now that they're empowering teachers to act like counselors, which is disastrous. There's all sorts of dual relationships. Remember when we were kids, if you're older, they used to say, if you feel uncomfortable about something that's happening around you, tell an adult you trust. You know, it could be the teacher. It could be the counselor. It could be the principal. It could be your friend's mom. It doesn't matter. We wanted kids to trust adults. And whereas kids, we were told to trust the adults. So if somebody's being hurt, if somebody's being bullied, if somebody's, you know, if you think your friend is being abused at home, tell an adult. That used to be the environment that we were in. But the definition of a harm has so broadened now. And the power of the adult, quote unquote, who is trained or untrained in these interventions of safeguarding mental health is now creating this disaster of a situation. So now the teacher has to know about all of these things that are going on. And they're teaching the kids in the school that if your parents are yelling at you, are disciplining you, are spanking, well, that's abuse. You have to tell somebody. And now it's like all of these threats and fears are put into kids' minds. And what the system is doing is wedging itself in between kids and parents. So parents are the suspects. And the whole system, even just teaching kids the idea that your own parents might be doing something that you need to tell a teacher about. It just plants the idea. It already becomes divisive. It's a subtle difference from saying, if you know anything is happening with any kid around you, tell an adult about it. Tell your parent, your friend's parent, tell your teacher. That's building trust with adults. But when kids are directly being told that it's important for them to tell their teacher of something that their parent is doing that's making them uncomfortable, it just plants the seed that your parent could be the enemy. You know, it kind of smells of the serpent coming into the garden in Genesis. You know, why did God not want you to eat that tree? Eat the fruit of that tree? Why did he say that? Let's plant that little seed of doubt. You know, whereas, no, of course, are there parents who are hurting their kids? Of course. But that is not the reality to the extent that every kid in every classroom should be taught to look at their parents suspiciously if they feel uncomfortable. Kids are going to feel uncomfortable. If kids don't feel uncomfortable, their parents are doing something wrong. That's a whole nother episode. We'll definitely have to talk about that some other time. But this is also her point in the book, and she does end on this point too. Like, how do you do healthy parenting then? You have to get comfortable with knowing that your kids are going to be uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable with knowing that your kids might be unsafe. And this is a big deal. But safeguarding our children from every possible scrape and scratch is the worst thing that we could ever do for them if we want them to be resilient, strong, mature adults. We have to let them ride the bike a little too fast. We have to let them play in the dirt and maybe catch some germs. These kinds of things are part of what healthy parenting has looked like forever. And now it's being completely eviscerated because this idea of delicacy and fragility and safety has completely ballooned out of control. So this is her book. These are the principles that she's basically laying out here. I think this is really, really important. Now, how does she throw out the baby with the bathwater? Well, first of all, I've already mentioned that obviously trauma is a real thing. Obviously therapy is a good thing. Obviously we all need help. And there are ways to get the help of a therapist. And she kind of says this. She kind of throws a bone a little bit. But then she basically washes it away with just how bad everything else is really happening in the therapeutic world. If we have integrated therapy, which is connected to the whole person, the whole picture of the person, a standard of understanding of who the person is, which has to be a Catholic standard, then having a guide, a mentor, somebody to walk with us to help us grow into the fullness of our humanity is absolutely essential. And we've known this forever. Spiritual direction is an example of that. Having mentors in our life, having people we can look up to. These are normal things. And those people will sometimes help us through the rough spots. And that could look like therapy. It's like the secular world has zeroed in on only that as the thing that's important and then just completely messed it up. Whereas what we say with our Catholic standard is we're walking people towards their flourishing, towards their fullness. And because people have ruts and they get broken bones along the way and they get into spaces of darkness and there is spiritual desolation and there is emotional and psychological desolation, it is necessary to have a guide who knows how to help walk people through those dark spots, which is why our model of integration is so important. Because spiritual directors not formed in knowing how to walk people through the emotional, psychological distresses of their life are not going to be able to holistically help somebody really flourish. And therapists who are not trained in understanding the spiritual life are not going to actually be able to help anybody through those ruts and through those dark times. We need both. Just because that doesn't exist yet doesn't mean it's not what we need. Just because those programs don't exist yet doesn't mean it's not what we need. It's actually what we need. It's why we built our certification program. It's why we are training people in the spiritual life and a philosophical understanding of the whole person and psychological sciences. Now, by the way, my mentor, one of my professors who taught this to me was Dr. Paul Vitz. Dr. Paul Vitz, he's recently retired, but he has a long, illustrious career as a professor and as a trailblazer of Catholic psychology. In 1977, he published a book called Psychology as Religion, The Cult of Self-Worship. And I want to give a plug to this book, which is better and more important than Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier. Because Bad Therapy by Abby Shrier is the fruit and culmination of everything that Paul Vitz prophesied about 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago. 1977, he wrote this book. And he saw the trends that were developing because of humanistic psychology, the work of Carl Rogers, and a lot of this divorced understanding of the human person without any grounding in spiritual, transcendent, objective truth about the goodness and beauty of the person. What we're made for, principles on how a person acts, what is the good life, what is good action, what is virtue, what are characteristics of a good person, to build character. Basic principles of being human thrown out the window. And all of it now is about how you feel and what do you want? What is your truth? I mean, now we're at this extreme absurdity of what gender do you want to be? That's just the fruit, the culmination. That's the cherry on top of this sundae that's been being built for a really long time. So I would recommend, even before getting to bad therapy, that you read Psychology as Religion, The Cult of Self-Worship. And Dr. Paul Vitz is presenting at our Summit of Integration. And I've got a couple copies of this. Actually, I got some first print editions. I'm going to have him sign, and we'll be giving away, I think, some copies there if he agrees to it. He is really a trailblazer in this space because he saw these things ahead of time and he had courage. He was a tenured professor at NYU, and he had the courage to speak out against this before there was other people doing what we're doing now. And if it feels like we're isolated in this field now, I can't even imagine what it felt like in 1977. And Father Benedict Rochelle, who I've talked about often here too, probably a little easier for him because he was a Franciscan, but he got his doctorate at Columbia, and he was in New York, doing the same kinds of things around the same time, and also calling out some of these problems for what they were in the world and in the church as they were filtering out into the church. There's a lot to be done here. We've got our work cut out for us. Please pray for us in this work. If you are at all interested in getting involved and learning more about this integration, I encourage you to check out our Summit of Integration, CatholicPsych.com/summit, and we are going to have it recorded. So even after the event itself, you could get access to that as well online. We are continuing to promote our certification program, and so we have information about that on our website. This is a huge, huge work that we are doing right now to help bring together a proper understanding of the person, and it has an effect. That's one thing I really love about Shrier's book is she's pointing out how consequential all of this is. And a lot of people listening or thinking about this might say, like, okay, these are really abstract ideas. What does this really have to do with me? She's telling you exactly how it has to do with you. So, like I said, spend some time with these. It'll be worth your time. And until then, God bless you.
Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to help us spread the word and hear more, please head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and subscribe, as it really helps us to get our content out to more people. Be sure to listen next time as I take you deeper into what it means to be human. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.